Hello and welcome to polyplane.com. Today we're going to be talking about extrusions. I like to think about extrusions as simply just pulling points out from one dimension to another. A point can be considered 0D, and if you extrude that out to another dimension, you get a curve. That would be considered 1D. If you extrude that out, 2D. Extrude that out, 3D. And you could extrude this out again and again if you wanted to, because you're just pulling out points. But for computer modeling, you only really need to go into 3D, 4D if you're doing quantum mechanics or that sort of thing. There's multiple types of extrusions. The three we're going to be talking about today include extrude curve, extrude to a point, and extrude along a curve. I have a series of shapes here on my ground plane, which is this grid that you can see. This is also known as a construction plane. We'll get into construction planes at a later time, but I just want you to have a frame of reference of where these things are in space. If I were to click on my solids tool and click on the extrude icon, or go up to solid and then extrude planar curve straight and click on one of these objects, I can extrude it out into space. I can do this for each of these types. It doesn't matter what the curve looks like. It'll extrude right up off the ground. This also works for multiple curves, such as two concentric circles. It'll recognize the two as one object. If I were to undo that and draw a third line in this circle, and then extrude that, you can see that it recognizes that third circle as its own entity. And likewise, this same idea works for organic shapes. So you can have varying degrees of wall thickness. You can also extrude surfaces out. I did that by just typing extrude SRF, but you can do it in solid, extrude surface, straight. Or if you go to the solids, and the bottom right icon is extrude surface. Click on your surface, hit enter, and then drag it out to however deep you need it. That's how extrude straight works. Let's take a look at extrude to a point. I'm going to switch over to my front view and do this from here so you can see what's going on. If I select my object, go up to solid, extrude to point, now you can see that it's actually extruding up, maintaining that same profile, but the extrusion is going to a point. This also works for all sorts of different types of curves that can be closed or open. And now you can see what those shapes look like. If I look at this from the underside though, you'll see there is still dimensionality there on the inside. There haven't been too many instances where I've needed to use the extrude to a point tool. However, I want you to see this tool because it shows that you don't just have to extrude something directly straight up and have the same profile all the way through. It can start to have varying surface topology. You can also use the extrude to a point tool on surfaces. So if I go to solid, extrude surface to a point, it'll do the same thing. In this case, it kind of made a pyramid type shape. The last extrusion type that I'd like to talk about is called extruding along a curve. This is just as it sounds. You're pulling the points, but they're following along a curve. If I select my curve, go up to solid, extrude planar curve, along curve, it's going to ask me to select the path curve near start, which means what curve do I want it to follow near its starting point. So I want it to follow this, and now it's asking me for a starting point on that curve. We'll just click near the bottom. And now you can see it starts to follow that curve. This is really, really useful for filling up gaps that you might have in your geometry, or perhaps you want some specific sort of profile that follows along some edge. You can see the extrusion tool is extremely powerful as soon as you start playing with what dimension it goes through. This also works for surfaces. So if I use the same tool, solid, extrude surface along curve, and select that curve, it's going to follow along that curve. Now for the surface, it's going to follow that curve to its completion and not give you the option of where to start, usually. There might be instances that you come across where you have that option. This also works with straight curves too. I would go to solid, extrude planar curve, along curve, click my profile that I want to extrude, click the curve, and then click a starting point, and it will just follow right along that curve. Now there's other ways to do this, but to do this sort of a shape, but I just wanted to show you that a straight line can work too. Now with specific shapes, you're going to get a little bit of distortion in your form. So if I try to extrude this out along the curve, watch what happens. Right about here, you start to get a little bit of a geometry issue. This is because the shape is actually staying parallel to whatever ground plane you're working on. So you have to use a little bit of caution when using this tool because you don't want bad geometry. In order to solve for this, I might just extrude this up and then bend it and, you know, play around with that until I get it to the shape I want. Now there's other ways to get this sort of a shape, and we're going to go into those in later videos, but I just want to show you what kind of issues you might come across when extruding. You're going to have the same issue with a really organic form like this if you're to extrude this along a curve. If I click on the rail, bring the start point, you can see the same thing starts happening. When you start beating that radius, you're going to get a lot of funkiness going on in your geometry. So you have to be careful about how much extruding you do along a curve, because at a certain point it'll start to, the geometry will bend back on itself. So you can get away with something like that, but nothing too much further. I mean, this is a point of caution, I would say, for all closed curves, and it really depends on how tight your radius is. This is all, again, due to the fact that the curve is staying parallel to the ground plane that it's constructed on. So like here, when I extruded the square, it started to bend back on itself, and I wasn't even able to cap because of how much of a bend there was. I'd like to show you one other thing with this. Say this curve was kind of a little more wiggly, so something like this. And I decide to extrude this along a curve. As I go along this path, you can see this time it was able to do it with pretty minimal distortion or geometry artifacts going on. However, you can see that because it was parallel to the ground, it's going to get a little bit skinny with its wall thickness here because it's staying totally perpendicular to that curve and not flowing with it. When we get into sweeping operations, you'll see how this is remedied. So I'm hoping this gives you a better understanding of how the extrusion tool works. You can rapidly create shapes and then extrude them out so that you can further manipulate them and do all the things that you might need to do to create your finished model. Thanks for watching and have a great day.